So the purpose of this video will be to get Locke's view of meaning on the table. We're going to see some objections to it later on, but we got to first understand what it is before we are to understand the objections. So Locke basically has one big idea which motivates all of the view of language in the chapter that you've seen. And his basic idea is that it looks like the function of language is to allow us to share thoughts. Well, what do we mean by sharing a thought? Here an example is helpful. So let's imagine we're both out in the forest and you start picking some mushrooms. And I see that you have started picking some mushrooms that are poisonous. Now here I'm having a thought, that mushroom is poisonous, and you're not having that thought, presumably because you're ignorant of that fact. And this is a situation where it looks highly desirable for me to be able to share my thought with yours. I want you to be able to have the same thought that I'm having, because if you don't, it may have pretty bad repercussions for you and your health. And again, this is just sort of a truism, but obviously the way that I get you to share that thought with me is just by saying something. I might say that mushroom is poisonous, or I might say don't pick that mushroom, or something else. But one way to share my thought with you is just by saying some sort of sentence. And interestingly, with a sentence like that, it's kind of hard to see how else you would do it. Like imagine you were not allowed to speak to somebody else. How would you share with them the thought that that mushroom is poisonous in a situation like that? Seems very hard. So clearly the language is very beneficial to us in situations like this. It allows for a very easy sharing of thoughts. And it's hard to see with certain thoughts how else you could share them except with some kind of language. So this is Locke's main idea. So he thinks basically whatever meaning is, however language works, it should be such that it explains this fundamental fact, because the whole point of language is to share thoughts. So whatever meaning is, it'll have to explain this ability that we have to share thoughts through language. On the basis of this idea, Locke argues for what you might call an ideas-based view of meaning. Locke's idea is that words stand for ideas, essentially. That for a word to be meaningful is for it to stand for a particular idea. And in particular, it stands for an idea in the mind of whoever is using the word. So let's take an example. Let's just take my name. This is an expression, and it's clearly a meaningful one. It's a meaningful part of our language. On Locke's view, this has a particular meaning as used by me, and that meaning is just my idea of myself. So, draw an arrow and let's, I don't know if you can draw pictures of ideas, but here's a picture of my idea of me. So I've got the glasses, got the messy hair. So this is a picture of my idea of me, and this is a picture representing the fact that on Locke's view, the meaning of a phrase like my name, as used by me, is my idea of myself. And more generally, you can see Locke is basically saying that this sort of relationship here, so here this is sort of a picture of the standing for relationship. This is really just a general picture of what meaning is. For a word to be meaningful is for a particular person is just for it to stand for that particular person's idea. So this was one particular example, but he'll think the same kind of thing goes for maybe a word like chair, the same kind of thing goes for a word like dog, and so on. So far we've seen that one, the core idea is we want to explain this fact that language allows us to share thoughts, and two, Locke thinks that for this reason, we should think that what it is for a word to mean something is for it to stand for an idea. Now, Locke actually doesn't say a huge amount in detail about how he thinks that his theory achieves the goal of explaining why language allows us to share thoughts. But you can sort of get the intuitive idea. Now, I'm not going to say more about it here because I want to leave that as an exercise for you guys. Something I want you to do is try to say, in your own words, why might a theory like this, where words stand for ideas, Why might that be a theory which explains Locke's core explanandum, that why it explains this fact about thought sharing? Because, as I say, he's not quite explicit about how he thinks this is supposed to work. And it's important for you guys to try and think through how might he have thought that worked. So at this point I want you to remember a distinction we made in the first lecture, which was, remember, it was this distinction between a semantic question and a metasemantic question. The semantic question is, well, what does a particular word, expression, something like that, what does a particular linguistic item mean? What is its meaning? And the metasemantic question was, how does it get that meaning? And one thing that's really interesting is that even in Locke, which is this really, in the scheme of things, very early piece of philosophy of language, both questions are arising at the same time. So we've just seen an answer to the semantic question given by Locke. So Locke's answer to the semantic question of what does an expression like David Boylan mean, Locke's answer is, well, as used by David Boylan, its meaning is just my idea of myself. And as used by you, the meaning of it would be your idea of me. But he's also sensitive to this other question of how do words get their meanings? And he thinks that this idea that meanings are, to be meaningful is just to stand for an idea, actually has an important metasemantic upshot. Now he doesn't call it that, but this is in effect what it is. Because he thinks that his theory places certain kinds of constraints, and constraints that he thinks are sort of commonsensical, but it places limits on the things that we can mean with our words. In particular, he thinks, well, we can't make our words stand for things that we're not aware of, because words stand for ideas. The only ideas that we have, the only ideas that we're aware of are the ideas that we have ourselves. So an idea could never stand for something that we're not aware of. We can only know the meaning of something if we sort of have an idea of the thing that it's supposed to stand for. So for instance, to give a particular example, take the word pangolin. If you have no idea what a pangolin is, then that word is basically meaningless to you. You can't understand the meaning of it in any sense if you don't know what a pangolin is. Maybe given the events of last year, more of you know what pangolins are than you did before. But you can easily get yourself into the frame of mind by thinking of pre-2020, whether you knew what a pangolin was. But this theory actually has an interesting consequence. Because remember, Locke says that, well, for each person, the word stands for their idea. Now, whose ideas are you aware of? Are you aware of everybody's ideas, or are you only aware of your own? And Locke wants to say, well, you're actually only aware of your own ideas. I may sort of indirectly know that if you're looking at that particular mushroom, that maybe you're thinking about it, and you have an idea of it in your head. But I'm not sort of directly aware of that idea that you have. And so Locke thinks this means that, well, as used by me, mushroom can only mean my idea of a mushroom and not mean your idea of a mushroom. So not only is there just general constraint put on what kinds of things we can mean by this theory, but in particular, language use ends up being very sort of idiosyncratic, you might say, on this view, because for each of us, all of our words mean our own ideas, and they can't stand for each other's ideas, because if they were to stand for each other's ideas, then I would have to be aware of your ideas, which is something I'm not. I don't have the ability to be aware of your ideas. It's worth mentioning this because something really interesting has happened. I suspect that at least a few of you, before, when you read the chapter, maybe before you started thinking about the lecture, thought, it's just obviously commonsensical, this view of language. It's just obviously common sense to think that words stand for ideas. And indeed, it seemed like common sense to Locke. But now we're already getting to a slightly odd conclusion, which is that our words mean our own particular ideas. We've ruled out the idea that a word can stand for both my ideas and your ideas on the basis of this metasemantic idea that in order for a word to mean something for me, I have to be aware of what it means. And this is a bit less commonsensical than the idea that we started with. The idea that, like, my words only mean my ideas and they don't mean your ideas, That's a bit less commonsensical than the general thought that words stand for ideas. And indeed, as we're going to see in the next video, it actually leads to some problematic things for Locke.